This morning we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to be in the first 16 verses, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So last week we talked about kind of sin, but also immorality, if you will. So immorality, immoral sins, and how Paul was writing to them telling them, hey, these are things you're doing that you shouldn't be doing. These are things you're doing that aren't right. In this chapter, Paul is saying, hey, these things that you're not doing aren't right. So Paul is going to be talking about kind of the same immoral sins that he was talking about. Now he's saying those immoral sins are okay inside of marriage, right? So as we walk through this, and I know we have some younger kids in here, I'm not going to get too far into detail. I'll let you tell your kids and grandkids all about those things. You can have fun with those conversations, and you should. Isn't it better that they hear about those things from mom and dad than from the friends on the school field? Yes. That they hear about them talked about by their pastor instead of by someone on a movie? That grandma and grandpa talk about these things with them, with information versus someone on the TV. May we not be afraid to talk about these things. May we not be afraid. I think a lot of times in the Christian realm, we think, well, we can't talk about those things because then they'll have too many questions, and if we bring up too many questions, then they'll go off and explore. Do you know if you answer a lot of the questions the kids have, they'll be like, okay. People are going to be curious. So that's where we as a church need to rally around each other and to help each other grow as Christians to know what is right, what is wrong, what God has made for good, what Satan has tried to make wrong. So this morning we're going to be talking about, we'll call it marital relations. We're going to be talking about marital relations. And another part of this, we're also going to be talking about divorce. I know there's some in here that have been married before and divorced. I am not making light. I am not passing judgment. It is a difficult thing to walk through. I've had friends, I've had relatives, I've had close people to me walk through divorce. Do not think that I'm making light of that. Do not think that I'm just passing it over or passing judgment. I want you to know what God's word says about it, but I want you to know that God is a forgiving God. And He will forgive anything where we mess up. Just remember that. We heard about these things last week and how God makes things for good and Satan turns them to bad. And now we learn about what God has made in marriage. There's great things about marriage. And how the marriage of a man and wife resembles Christ in us as His church. Did you know that's why Satan wants to combat marriage so badly? It's because it is the image of Christ in the church. When you tear down marriage between a man and a woman and make it anything else than what God has made it, you destroy a covenant that God has made. May we never forget that. May we never forget that there are reasons why God has in the Bible about marriage. That's why there's so much in the New Testament about it. And so as we walk through this, let us remember that. I do have some funny stories, though, to get us off on a fun start. In 2005, the Guinness Book of World Records said that Percy and Florence Arrowsmith held two records. The longest marriage of a living couple of 80 years, and having the largest married couple's aggregate age of 205 years. Both Mr. and Mrs. Arrowsmith have since died, but they left good advice for those who want to have a lasting marriage. Florence said, "You must never go to sleep bad friends. If you've had a quarrel, you make it up. Never be afraid to say, 'I'm sorry.'" Percy had a slightly more humorous advice. He said the secret to his long marriage was just two words: "Yes, dear." So guys, remember that. There's a secret from people who've been married 80 years. A lot of times I get that wrong. You can just ask Julie, she'll tell you. Another piece of advice would be, while attending a marriage seminar in communication, Tom and his wife Grace listened to the instructor. It is essential, the instructor said, that husbands and wives know each other's likes and dislikes. He addressed the men. Can you name your wife's favorite flower? Tom, thinking, leaned over, touched Grace's arm gently and says, it's Pillsbury, right? Guys, if you don't know your wife's favorite flower, Flower, you might want to know that. You might also want to know their favorite flower, Flour, because they're not going to bake any more cookies. So just remember those two pieces of advice. Yes, dear, and know their flower. That'll get you out of a lot of trouble. There's been many of I'm sorries with a bouquet of roses and bouquets of other things. So just remember those two pieces of advice. Julie and I are coming up on our 5th year anniversary. So I think I got this thing down pretty good. This morning, though, we'll be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 16. And the main theme of this whole thing is what God has brought together in marriage. Let us not separate. Let us fight every day for our marriages. Let us fight every day for our children's marriages, for our grandchildren's marriages. Let us do everything we can to uphold that covenant that Jesus Christ has set forth for us. In verses 1 through 7, we see Paul here talking. I'm going to read these first verses here, the first 7. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now as a concession, not a command, I say this, I wish that all you were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. So Paul was talking to the folks here in the church of Corinth, telling them, it's okay to do your marital duties. You see, the people at the church of Corinth thought, well, we're saved now. We need to live a celibate lifestyle. That's their thought. That's why Paul was addressing this. They thought, well, we're saved and all that other stuff is immoral and it's defiling to the body, so we don't need to do it. So we just stop. But Paul comes and says, no. You see, in the first verses before this, right, he said, outside of marriage, it's what? Wrong, immoral. Inside of marriage, it's good and beautiful. The church at Corinth needed to understand that outside, bad. And here's for those folks that may not be the best at thinking. Outside bad, inside good. Right? That's basically what Paul is telling them here, that marital relations was a good thing because Christians are not called to celibacy inside of marriage, and they're not called to singleness. You see, the Catholic Church with their priests has said that, well, they need to be celibate and they need to be single and they can never be married. Yet, I don't know about you guys, but nowhere in my Bible have I ever read that. You see, they are taking away what God has made for good. And I think that's why, and as we get down into some of these lower verses, you see why there is so much sin when it comes to their position. And not just their position, but a lot of positions where people are told, oh, you must be celibate. You must never get married. But instead, the Bible says it's okay. But it does say this celibacy should be used at times. Let's continue reading on here. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come again, so that Satan may not tempt you. You see, Satan is smart. Satan and his minions are not idiots. They know exactly how to tear apart families. You tear people apart by going at the desires of their flesh. As married couples, we need to remember that we don't use this, what we're talking about today, as a bargaining chip. We don't say, I don't like how you're acting right now. I'm not going to do this. The Bible clearly states what it's talking about here. We need to freely bless each other. We need to help each other deal with those temptations. And I'm not saying in every case where someone goes off and cheats or commits adultery or has a temptation with pornography is because of this. That's not the case. But you know how you help it not be? You love your wife and you love your husband. Paul says here as well that sometimes, though, you need to take a break. But why should we take a break? It says specifically to devote yourselves to prayer. Notice it's almost like a fasting. You break apart to draw closer to God. Because when you start to draw closer to God, you'll start to draw closer to your spouse. And so when we look at this chapter, we also see that, notice how in verses 3 down it says, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Our bodies are not our own, especially when we first start with Christ. Let's look at the marriage as depiction of Christ in the church. We are not our own when it comes to Christ. We are bought with a price. Our bodies and our lives are His. What is the world said when it comes to marriage and people just wanting to divorce for any reason? You're your own person. Make your own choices. Whatever makes you feel good, you do it. Do you know, nowhere in there does it ever talk about how it will impact the other person? I read a story one time about a husband who wanted to cheat on his wife, who wanted a divorce. And he said, I want a divorce because it'll make me happier. And the counselor said, well, how will it make your wife feel? And he goes, that's not my problem. You see, what Paul is talking about here is that when you become married in one flesh, you're no longer yourself. Your selfishness, you have to put beside yourself. Your wants and needs have to become second to your wife's wants and needs, and vice versa. You have to become one flesh to come together. Not just in marital relations, but in other things as well. And that's what Paul's getting to here, is that we're not your own. What Paul is not saying here, and let's be specific, is about abuse and about forceful marital relations. That is not what he's saying. Some have used this passage to say that a man should get what a man wants anytime a man wants it, and the wife has no decision over that. Not true. A man treats his wife with respect and treats other women with respect every step of the way. Treats her like a treasure. And a wife treats her husband like a treasure. So what he's saying here is the selfishness. Not about what you have and what you can control, but not to be selfish. Not to say, well, I'm just going to do what I want because it makes me happy. I don't care about you. That's not what Paul's saying here. Paul's saying that for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement, for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Notice all this that Paul is saying is because he knows and that God knows we're terrible as human beings when it comes to self-control. We're bad at it. Especially when it comes to sins of temptation, physical temptation and lust. We're not good at those attacks repeatedly without a way out. And that's what marriage has done. That's what God has created in marriage. A way to extinguish those burning desires. And I think it's a beautiful thing that sometimes we don't talk about enough in church. That what God has made in marriage is beautiful. I'm happy to be married. I love my wife. I don't know what I'd do without her. I probably wouldn't be your pastor right now if I wasn't married to her. Because how she has helped me grow as a Christian as well. How she's helped me push forth and supported me. And so that's how Paul is talking about all this stuff in the beginning. It's a lot of it is being unselfish. It's loving your spouse. And it's showing that marriage is a good thing and there are good things about marriage. And that's why some say, well, then you need to be single. It's not a call to singleness. In verses 8 and 9, you see Paul talking about singleness now. And I'll tell you this, that Christians can live a fulfilled single life. If you're single out there and God hasn't shown you a spouse, or maybe your spouse has left you, or what happened, whatever it is. And we believe that Paul was probably a widower. From a lot of the stuff we see, he was probably a widower. We think his wife possibly passed away, and that's what a lot of things say. Look at what Paul was able to do, and look what Paul says here in verses 8 and 9. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than burn with passion. You see, Paul here is talking about, look at all the great things you can do as a single person. Now, I'm not saying that if you're married that you should go off tomorrow and get divorced and say, see, Phil said I can be better single, so I need to get rid of you. I'm going to kick you out to the door. That's not what I'm saying. Some of you wives are probably looking at him going, yeah, I could be better off single. Husbands would be like, yeah, I could probably go hunting more if I was single. I could go shooting. I could spend more gun money. People always ask me about my collection. I'm like, yep, that happened all before I was married. Because now you got different priorities. Same with boats, right? They always tell you, buy boats and guns before you get married, because once you get married, can't buy them then. But Julie did say we can have another boat, so I married a good one. But Paul says here, he goes, to the unmarried and widows, I say it is good for them to remain single, as I am. Look at what Paul was able to do as someone who was single. Do you think it would have been more difficult in his day and age to travel and do his missional trips if he had a wife, 2 or 3 kids, and a full family? Paul is saying, look, if God has brought singleness to your life, use it as a gift. Use it as a way to go on mission trips. Use it as a way to do whatever you need for the Lord. You have freedom in that. There's freedom in serving the Lord as a single person because you no longer have the responsibilities of a family. God is your family. The church is your family. You have the ability to go forth and conquer. I'm not saying that you can't be married, and I'm not saying you shouldn't be married, remarry. But I was a single guy until I was 29. And it took me a while in those last couple years of singleness to realize the freedom of what God had placed me in singleness. To realize how I could focus on my life with Christ so much more as a single man and make sure that my life was closer to Christ before I even pulled a family into it. Some people say, well, if I just get married, I'll be a better Christian. Well, if I just, do this or do that, I'll be a better Christian. Once I have a family, once I get married, I'll come to church more because, I'll have kids and they'll need to come to church more. Just because you get married, just because you have a family, doesn't mean everything's going to be better. If your life is not closer to God now, as a single person, there's no guarantee that your life will be closer to God as a married person. So in your stage of life now, enjoy it. Ask God how God can show you how to serve Him in a meaningful way if you're not doing so. And then Paul says, though, he goes, but listen, hey, you have freedom in singleness, but you know what? If you have no self-control, go ahead and get married. Go ahead and tie that knot. Enjoy married life. The third point we have here is Christians and rules for divorce. Let me say before we even get into this subject, if you are being abused in your marriage, I do not advocate sticking around just for the fact of being abused. If you're being abused, you have laws and you have rights to combat that. Do not settle for abuse. Do not settle for violence in your home. If you need help, come talk to somebody. This is not what I'm talking about in this part, but I wanted to make it clear. Abuse is wrong, and abuse should not be treated by anyone. It should not be allowed. And we as a church will stand behind you 100%. So just remember that. And I don't think there's any of that going on in here, but I want to make sure it's said. We love you, and we will stand behind you. In verses 10 through 16, we see, to the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. Paul is saying that because Jesus had said this. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband not divorce his wife. So here Paul is saying, look, fight for your marriage. Fight to keep it alive. Fight to reconcile. Like I said, I know some in here have been divorced. And I don't want to go through how difficult that must have been, because I don't know. But if you're married now and you're remarried, fight for that marriage. Ask God to help you. He will. If you're going through marriage issues, come to me. Let's talk about it. Let's sit down and do some counseling. And if it's something that I can't counsel you on, I will help you find counseling. But I want to see all these marriages in this church thrive because I think it makes us a stronger and better church. Verse 12, it says, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. So this is Paul saying it because the Lord hadn't spoken, Jesus hadn't spoken it. That if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children should be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So in the Bible, the big thing that we see is that there are specific reasons for Christians when it comes to divorce. You can look in Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew chapter 19 for those specific reasons. The main reason being adultery. But when it comes to divorce, we must search the scriptures and seek advice to know what's going on. If what you're thinking is right now divorce, please come talk to somebody. Let's talk it out. Please seek counseling. If counseling's not working, let's try something new. But here Paul is saying, though, when he's talking about this specific, he's talking to the Corinthians because the Corinthians got saved and they were married to pagans and they said, well, we're saved now, we're going to ditch these folks. They're not saved anymore. That's not what Paul was saying. Paul was trying to say, look, stay married to him. Stay married to him. Witness to him. Notice he says here, and I want to make a point, that it says, if the unbeliever should not divorce her, if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, he has consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Just because you marry someone doesn't make them saved. It's not what this passage is saying. There's been a lot of people that think, well, I'm going to go be a missionary dater, and I'm going to date this person who's unsaved because I can turn their heart. I'm going to let you know that doesn't usually work out that well. If a boyfriend or girlfriend is doing something that you don't like before you date them, they're not probably going to stop doing it after you date them just because you said so. Well, I don't like that that person cusses, but I know when I date them, I'm going to tell them to stop cursing. Sure, you can try it. Probably not going to work. But rather, he's talking here that if you become saved and your husband or your spouse isn't saved, try to stay with them. If you have kids, even more so. Because your witness and testimony to that other spouse could bring them to Christ. My dad got saved in 1975, and shortly thereafter, about a year after, my mom got saved. My mom grew up in a Baptist church all her life, but never got saved. And when my dad had the salvation experience to where his life radically changed, Mom saw it. She's like, well, what happened to you? He's like, I got saved. Oh. But then she realized that what she had was not true salvation. She had just gone through the motions. And through my father witnessing to her, about a year later, she got saved. So you see, that is a perfect depiction of what can happen. I know some spouses in here probably got saved before the other. So Paul was talking to the Corinthians here to say, hey, don't just divorce somebody because they're not saved and you got saved. Fight for them. Love them. Show them the love of Jesus Christ in your marriage. What better way for an unbelieving spouse to see the love of Jesus Christ than from their believing spouse? But he does give a caveat. He says, if it causes too much strife and they want to leave, let them. But notice he doesn't say, as soon as you get saved, let them go. There's some caveats. Remember that. He's saying fight for your marriage. And as Julie and Thad come up here to get ready to play us out of our invitation, what are you dealing with today? Is your marriage in a rocky spot? Are you fighting for your marriage every day? Because if you're not, Satan will find his way into it to separate you. I want to encourage you every day. Fight to keep your marriage alive. Fight for the marriages in your life. Love your husbands and wife. Be thankful that God has given you a husband or wife. And if your husband or spouse, your spouse isn't alive right now, Be thankful for the one that God had given you. Be thankful for who we have in our lives. Be thankful for the blessings. And maybe you're sitting here and you've never been married. Be thankful for that. Trust God in every part of our lives. If you're here today and you've never been saved, come down in front and talk to me. I'd love to talk to you about salvation and how you can have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. If you're here today and you've never been baptized or you want to join the church, I invite you to come down front and talk to me. As Brother Thad comes and leads us in a hymn of invitation, I'll be down front if there's anything else you want to deal with.